After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the development of psychoanalysis after the death of Sigmund Freud, learn about the defense mechanisms as modified by Anna Freud, understand how the ego can be autonomous and independent as postulated by Hartmann, learn about the functions of the ego and how the ego helps in adaptation, learn how ego psychology is different to orthodox psychoanalytical theory yet loyal to traditional psychoanalytical enterprise as developed by Sigmund Freud. The death of Sigmund Freud in 1939 led to major developments in the psychoanalytical theory. Upon Freud's death, many of his followers decided to amplify aspects of Freud's system to make more explicit some of Freud's postulates, to sharpen definitions of some of the basic concepts, and to extend the range of phenomena covered by psychoanalytical explanations. The most striking development in psychoanalytical theory since Freud's death is the new theory of the ego, also referred to as ego psychology. Although Freud regarded the ego as the executive of the total personality, he never granted it an autonomous position. It always remained subservient to the wishes of the id. After Freud's death, some psychoanalytical theorists, in contrast to Freud's position, proposed a greater emphasis on the role of ego in total personality. The major change these Freudian loyalists introduced into psychoanalysis is an expansion of the concept of the ego. Instead of being the servant to the id, the ego's role was extended. The ego was believed to be more independent of the id. The ego, according to these Freudian loyalists, possesses its own energy which is not derived from the id. Further, these neo-Freudian analysts suggested that the ego is free of the conflict produced when id impulses press for satisfaction. Two major figures that are associated with ego psychology are Anna Freud and Hans Hartmann. Biographical sketch: Anna Freud. Anna Freud is known to be the first of the ego psychologists and one of the founders of the child psychological movement. She was also the appointed heir of psychoanalysis after her father's death. Sigmund Freud searched for an intellectual heir which was bitterly unsuccessful with colleagues such as Carl Jung, ultimately succeeded with his own daughter. Sigmund Freud conducted Anna's training analysis and Anna ultimately became her father's intellectual custodian. Anna Freud was the youngest of the Sigmund Freud's 6 children. She was the only one of their children who devoted her life to psychoanalysis. The birth of Anna in 1895 was symbolic because it coincided with the birth of psychoanalysis and because Anna would be the only Freud's child to follow her father's path and become an analyst. Anna became interested in her father's work. From the age of 14, she would sit in a corner at the meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society, absorbing everything that was said. At the age of 22, Anna was psychoanalyzed by her father. In 1924, Anna read her first scholarly paper to the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society entitled Beating Fantasies and Daydreams. It was allegedly based on the case history of an anonymous patient, but it was actually about her own fantasies. She described dreams of an insidious father-daughter love relationship, a beating and sexual gratification through masturbation. The paper was well received by Freud and his colleagues and earned her admission to the society. Anna Freud is best known for her work on the ego and its defense mechanism. As described in her classic book, Freud's The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense. This gave a strong impetus to ego psychology. The work also was a pioneer effort in the development of adolescent psychology. In contrast to subsequent ego psychologists, she conceptualized the ego in a manner consistent with orthodox analytical view of the interrelationships among id, ego and superego. During World War II, she and a US associate, Dottie Burlingham, recounted their work in young children in wartime, infants without families, and war and children. Anna Freud made conceptual as well as technical modifications in psychoanalysis. She realized that free association was of little use with younger children. Her work in England with children ravaged by the traumatic events of World War II convinced her that an exclusive focus on intra-psychic conflict is inadequate with children. According to her, it is rather a child's past and present external reality that can greatly influence his or her behavior and pathology. In 1938, Anna Freud and her father, whom she had carried for during a number of years of his terminal illness, escaped from Nazi-dominated Austria. It was Anna who was responsible for all of the plans, finances and logistics of this move. She settled in London, where she worked at a Hampstead nursery until 1945. Anna Freud founded the Hampstead Child Therapy Course and Clinic, London in 1947 and served as its director from 1952 till her death in 1982. She viewed play as the child's adaptation to reality, but not necessarily as a revelation of unconscious conflicts. She worked closely with parents and believed that analysis should have an educational influence on the child. A summation of her thought is to be found in her normality and pathology in childhood. Anna Freud never married. She devoted her life to the application of psychoanalysis to emotionally disturbed children and to the care of her father during his long illness. Although Anna Freud never earned a higher degree, her work in psychoanalysis and child psychology contributed to her immense in the field of psychology. She also had a profound influence on Erik Erikson, who later went on to expand the field of psychoanalysis and ego psychology. Anna Freud influenced research in Freudian psychology. She standardized the records for children with diagnostic profiles, encouraged the pooling of observations from multiple analysts, and encouraged long-term studies of development from early childhood through adolescence. Despite the modifications made by Anna Freud in ego psychology, she regarded her formulations as consistent with Sigmund Freud's emphasis on instinctual impulses. Her basic loyalties to her father's work remained unimpaired. She devoted her life protecting her father's legacy. Ego psychology, Anna Freud. Anna Freud revised orthodox psychoanalytical theory, expanded the role of the ego as it functions independently of the id. Ego defense mechanisms. Defenses are unconscious and thought to originate in certain psychosexual developmental phases. Efforts directed at modifying defenses create anxiety and are often resisted by the individual. Resistance operates unconsciously. Defensive can be adaptive when they serve protective functions or maximize coping. However, they can be maladaptive when they minimize coping. Anna Freud elucidated and expanded the defense mechanisms by which the ego masters the environment and the shaping forces of each individual's psychopathology, the id and the superego. Initially and for many years, defense was defined only in terms of repression. Sigmund Freud maintained that repression was the predominant defense mechanism, that it was the chief tool available to the ego to defend itself against the environment and the impulses of the id. The major thrust of analysis, therefore, was to uncover and comprehend the content of the repressed material. Over time, and as ego psychology evolved, a series of defense mechanisms would be itemized, including regression, reaction formation, isolation, undoing, projection, introjection, turning against the self, and reversal into the opposite. Many of these defenses had been outlined by Freud. However, it was Anna Freud in her important work The Ego and the Mechanism of Defense who expounded upon the intricacies of these defense mechanisms with sensitively written clinical vignetties illustrating their origins and functions. She elaborated on and clarified the use of the defense mechanisms in protecting the ego from anxiety. The names and definitions she assigned are still the benchmark terminologies of psychoanalytical psychology. Repression, denial, reaction formation, undoing, rationalization, intellectualization, sublimation, displacement, and several others. Anna Freud's articulation of the richness of the defense mechanisms pointed analysts towards the examination of the dynamic processes operative within the ego itself. However, she maintained that analysis of the ego paled by comparison with analysis of the id. In this sense, and in contrast to subsequent ego psychologists, Anna Freud conceptualized the ego in a manner consistent with orthodox analytical view of the interrelationship among id, ego, and superego. Many of the behavioral manifestations previously considered by Freud to be direct expression of instincts were viewed by Anna Freud as serving defense functions. For example, anger could now be seen as a defense against anxiety. Following are a list of some of the defense mechanisms elaborated by Anna Freud. Ego defense mechanisms are following: repression, which means involuntary exclusion from conscious awareness of conflictual or painful impulses, thoughts, or memories. Denial, which means failure to recognize external reality. Reaction formation, which means exaggerated and emotional trend to help repress the opposite emotion. Underdoing, which means symbolic or actual negation of previous unacceptable thought or action. Rationalization, which means elaboration of socially acceptable reasons to justify feelings or actions that are unconsciously determined. Intellectualization, which means overuse of reasoning or logic to avoid awareness of feelings and impulses. Sublimation, which means partial gratification of an impulse by altering the aim or object to make it socially more acceptable. Displacement, which means affect originally attached to one object is transferred to a more incautious object. Introjection, which means assimilation of characteristics of an object into one's own ego or superego. Identification, which is modeling of oneself on another person or group, but with less intensity and completeness than with introjection. Idealization, which is overestimation of positive and underestimation of negative qualities of a desired object. Projection, which is attributing one's own acknowledged feelings and impulses to another person. regression, which is return to previous level of function or psychosexual stage. Biographical sketch, hence Hartmann. Hence Hartmann, psychoanalyst and physician, is considered to be the father of ego psychology. He was born on November 4, 1894 in an upper-class gentile VNC family of distinguished historians and academicians. Hartmann's family had been distinguished for several generations. One grandfather, Moritz Hartmann, was a well-known poet, essayist, professor and member of parliament. The other grandfather, Rodolph Kronbach, was an eminent physician and professor. Hartmann's father, Ludo Hartmann, was a professor of history and founder of public libraries and adult education. His mother, Gretchen Kronbach, was a successful sculptor and paintist. Although trained as an academic psychiatrist and as the staff of the University of Vienna Psychiatric Clinics, Hartmann grew to be deeply respectful of Freud's contributions. However, Freud originally distrusted Hartmann due to the psychiatric establishment's ambivalence towards psychoanalysis. In 1934, Hartmann chose to resign his post at the university clinic because of disagreements with the newly appointed head of the clinic and political decisions made by the recreatory government. These would have forced him to compromise his personal and scientific principles in order to gain a professorship. Anna Freud also was initially dubious of Hartmann's concepts, but with her approval and under her auspices, Hartmann began to win converts to his enlargement of the ego's role in adaptation. When Hartmann left the university clinic in Vienna, Adolf Meyer, the father of American psychiatry, offered him a position as full professor at Johns Hopkins Institute. To counter this possible move, Freud invited him to continue his training analysis free of charge if he would stay in Vienna. Hartmann accepted and entered his second analysis in 1934, which continued into 1936. In 1937, Hartmann read to the Vienna Society a paper on ego psychology that developed into a book, Inch Psyche and Ampelogro Problem, later published in English as Ego Psychology and the Problem of Adaptation. This paper marks the beginning of ego psychology. Along with Anna Freud, the ego and mechanisms of defense, that work was a decisive landmark in extending psychoanalysis into the ego-psychological areas that would be central for the next several decades. Hartmann became a member of the New York Psychoanalytical Institute and became a teacher and training analyst as he had been at the Vienna and Paris institutes. As Freud's heir apparent, he brought enormous prestige to the New York Institute and helped to heal its severe political infighting and nasty polarizing splits, but never became a public voice for popularizing psychoanalysis. Ego psychology, hence Hartmann, the ego reconceptualized. According to Hartmann, the id and the ego develop simultaneously and function independently, yet in synchrony. They evolve from an undifferentiated matrix with reciprocal influences on each other, emerging as products of differentiation. Each has its own biological roots and source of energy. Hartmann suggests that there is an undifferentiated phase early in life during which both the id and ego are formed. The ego does not emerge out of an inborn id, but each system has its origin in inherent predispositions and each has its own independent course of development. Thus, the ego and the instincts develop and function in an independent and complementary manner. As a result of this, the central role of the ego in development is to facilitate not only conflict among various agencies of the mind, the id, ego and superego, but also adaptation to the environment. The ego is the special organ of adaptation. Infants are born and immediately get equipped to fit into their environment. This is a marked difference from what the ego was conceptualized by Sigmund Freud. For Freud, the ego is always subservient to the id and is not independent. The ego develops as a result of three sets of factors, which are inherited ego characteristics, influences of the instinctual drives, and influences of outer reality. Ego functions. There are two main ego functions, primary autonomous functions and secondary autonomous functions. Primary autonomous ego functions are innate, inherited ego characteristics and are conflict free. It compromises the cognitive functions of perception, intelligence, thinking, comprehension, language and learning. Secondary autonomous ego functions are those functions that were once involved in developmental conflicts such as oral, anal or phallic, Oedipus, and were freed as a result of the resolution of those conflicts through the process of neutralization. For example, a child's ability to think clearly may be contaminated by conflicts around sexuality or aggression. Secondary autonomy of that function results in clear, unambiguous thinking following the resolution of those conflicts. Such ego functions become independent from the id, and the ego can use the available energies in the service of adaptation and mastery. Ego defenses. Hartmann suggests that the ego mobilizes defenses to protect itself from four types of dangers. These dangers are conflict among the id, ego and superego, conflict in interpersonal relationships, conflict in relation to social norms, and the disturbance that occurs in response to trauma. Ego defenses, according to Hartmann, do not have to be pathological or negative in character. They may serve healthy purposes in the formation of personality. Hartmann believed that a defense may become independent of its origin in combating the instincts and serve the functions of adjustment and organization. Adaptation and accommodation. Adaptation is a reciprocal and evolving process. Two changes take place with respect to adaptation. Alloplastic change takes place when an individual alters the environment to cope with challenges that he or she may encounter. In contrast, autoplastic change takes place when an individual shifts to accommodating to the environment by modifying aspects of him or herself to deal with reality. Four ego tasks involving the reconciliation of inner and intra-systematic conflicts occur for successful adaptation. 1. Maintaining a balance between individual and external reality. Second, establishing harmony within the id among its competing instinctual drives. Third, maintaining a balance among the three competing mental agencies, id, ego and superego. And last, maintaining a balance between its role in helping the id and its own independent role that goes beyond instinctual gratification. Evaluative comments, criticism and controversies. Ego psychology has had its share of criticism. The psychologist Robert Holt critically evaluated the concept of the autonomy of ego in Hartmann's writing and concluded that it will not come to occupy an important place in psychoanalytical thinking. He instead suggested to emphasize on the relative roles of drive, external stimuli and various inner structures in determining behavior and the complex interactions between them. Jacques Lacan fervently attacked ego psychology. He strongly criticized the ego psychologist concept of the healthy ego. Lacan challenged all the central concepts of ego psychology, such as the concepts of adaptation and the autonomous ego. According to Lacan, the ego is the enemy. His own conception of the ego suggests that it must be profoundly distrusted because it is unable to discriminate the individual's own desires from the desires of others. Lacan further suggests that the ego is not autonomous, but subordinated and alienated to the people and images with which it has identified during its development. Ego psychologists responded by doubting whether Lacan's approach is ever applied to clinical work with real patients who have real illnesses, specific ego functions mediating those illnesses and specific histories. Contributions. Ego psychology applied to many psychologists because it focuses on the traditional subject matter of psychology, namely perception, memory, learning and thinking. Anna Freud, Hartmann and other ego psychologists set out to make psychoanalysis part of scientific psychology. They did so by translating, simplifying and operationally defining Freudian notions. By encouraging the experimental investigation of psychoanalytic hypotheses and by modifying psychoanalytic psychotherapy. In the process, they fostered a more conciliatory relationship between psychoanalysis and academic experimental psychology. Ego psychology also appeals to many psychologists because it emphasizes the characteristic processes and behavior of the normal person in contradistinction to the deviant processes and behavior of a patient population. It also provides a theoretical framework for repairing abnormal psychosocial functioning and facilitating a better fit between an individual's psychological needs and the normative expectations of society. Further, ego psychology tends to place more emphasis on the rational, conscious, constructive aspects of human personality instead of the emphasis placed on the unconscious and irrational by classical psychoanalysis. It is said to be more humanistic than orthodox psychoanalytical theory. Ego psychology helped to move the psychoanalytical enterprise beyond the interpsychic focus of drive and psychopathology to a general theory of human development. It moved psychoanalysis from an isolated, self-contained treatment method to a sweeping intellectual discipline, a discipline that indirectly encouraged contributions from non-psychoanalytic sources. Specifically, Hartmann's success helped prepare psychology for some subsequent analytical schools, notably object relation theory, self-psychology, and continuing psychoanalytic attempts at biopsychosocial integration. Summary: the death of Sigmund Freud in 1939 led to major developments in psychoanalytic theory. The most striking development in psychoanalytical theory since Freud's death is the new theory of the ego, ego psychology. Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, is the first of the ego psychologists. Hence, Hartmann is regarded as the father and architect of ego psychology. Anna Freud elucidated and elaborated the major psychological defense mechanisms which are still broadly accepted. Hence, Hartmann reconceptualized the ego as independent, autonomous, that is not subservient to the id. Hence, Hartmann described psychological development from the perspective of adaptation, the employment of the defense mechanisms to allow the ego to fit together with its environment. Ego psychology focuses on this process as the central element of normal function and psychopathology. Ego psychological theory maintains that an undifferentiated matrix of psychic structure is present from birth and that id, ego and superego differentiate from it.